good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome to the Standing Committee on Human Services. My name is Ken Cheveldayoff. I'm the MLA for Saskatoon-Willow Grove, and I'll serve as the chair of the committee today. I'd like to introduce members that are present. Ms. Mira Conway is a member of this committee. She will be replaced by Mr. Love. Mr. Matt Love, welcome. Mr. Ryan Domitar, Mr. Mohammed Fayez, Mr. Derek Myers, Mr. Hugh Nerleen, and Ms. Alana Ross are also members of the committee. Pursuant to Rule 148, subsection 1, the following estimates were committed to the Standing Committee on Human Services on March 31st, 2022. The 2022-23 estimates are as follows. Votes 37 and 169 in advanced education, vote 5 in education, vote 32 in health, vote 20 in labor relations and workplace safety, and vote 36 in social services. Today, the committee will be considering the estimates for the Ministry of Education. Then we will take a brief recess and return to consider the estimates for the Ministry of Advanced Education, followed by consideration of Bill 61, the Post-Secondary Education and Skills Training Act 2021. We will now begin with vote 5, Education, Central Management and Services, subvote ED01. Minister Duncan is here with his officials. I would ask that officials please state their names before speaking into the microphone. As a reminder, please don't touch the microphones. The Hansard operator will turn your microphone on when you are speaking to the committee. So, Mr. Minister, please introduce your officials and go ahead and make your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here to discuss the Ministry of Education's 2022-23 budget and to help me with providing information to committee members. To my left is Donna Johnson, Deputy Minister. To my right is Rory Jensen, Assistant Deputy Minister. And seated behind us, Susan Nedelko-Vanderson, Assistant Deputy Minister. Jerry Craswell, Assistant Deputy Minister. Sarah Horluck, Acting Executive Director, Corporate Services. Shailene Salazar, Acting Executive Director, Education Funding. Janet Mitchell, Special Advisor on the Canada-wide Project. Cindy Jeans, Acting Executive Director of Early Learning and Childcare Renewal. And Mitch Graw, my Chief of Staff, is here as well. So thanks to our school divisions, child care facilities, libraries, and literacy programs for all the work that they have done this past year to support children, youth, and families across the province. Thanks to the work of the thousands of teachers, school staff, early childhood educators, library staff around the province, our children, youth, and families have been able to get back to some normalcy. This is important for both their mental and physical health. Since being appointed Minister of Education in 2020, I've had the opportunity to meet with and build relationships with many of the leaders in our education and early learning sectors. I've also had the chance to visit schools and other programs that are supporting children and families right across the province, and I'm pleased to see the phenomenal work that's going on in our schools and our programs firsthand. With that, I'm pleased to present this year's education budget. With Saskatchewan's economy back on track, we are able to invest in strong public services with a record investment in education. The 2022-23 budget provides $2.88 billion in funding to support the kindergarten to grade 12, early learning and childcare, library, and literacy sectors. This is an increase of $219.9 million, or an 8.3% increase over last year, and is the largest education budget in the province's history. With this budget, our government is committed to support families of young children in childcare, our classrooms, school infrastructure, and long-term planning of our public library system. This ultimately supports a strong Saskatchewan today and into the future. Saskatchewan's 27 school divisions will receive $1.99 billion in school operating funding for the 2022-23 school year. This is an increase of $29.4 million, or 1.5% over this current school year. This increase in operating funding provides an additional $6 million for learning supports for students, bringing the total investment in supports for learning to $299.9 million in the 2022-23 school year. The additional funding will support positions such as psychologists, speech-language pathologists, occupational therapists, and other professionals and paraprofessionals that provide support to Saskatchewan students. The increased operating funding also provides $23.4 million to fully fund the negotiated 2% salary increase for teachers. We know that teacher salary costs are one of the largest cost factors for schools. In addition to the increase in operating funding, we've created a new $7 million fund that will allow school divisions to hire up to 200 additional full-time educational assistants, or EAs, for the 2022-23 school year. We've heard loud and clear from parents and caregivers about the importance of EAs in supporting students to reach their full potential. EAs are also an important support for teachers in managing increasingly diverse classrooms. This new funding follows on our government's commitment that was made in the 2021 speech from the throne. Since 2007, school operating funding has seen an overall increase of $576 million. This is a 40.8% increase, which is higher than the 30.7% increase in enrollment and costs associated with the Teacher Collective Bargaining Agreement. The Ministry of Education will continue to work with school divisions in reviewing their expenses and monitoring the impact of inflationary factors on their operations. Our government is also continuing to support students attending qualified independent schools, historical high schools, and associate schools. These schools offer parents and families choice when choosing where to educate their children. We believe this choice is important, and we're continuing to see enrollment growth in many of these schools. With that in mind, this budget provides $17.5 million in operating grants for qualified independent schools and historical high schools for the 2022-23 school year. This includes an increase of $2.3 million for qualified independent schools to support increased enrollment and the creation of a new funded qualified independent school category. The new funded category, called Certified Independent Schools, was created in response to the growth and expansion of qualified independent schools. It creates an intermediate step between a qualified independent school and associate schools that will allow these schools to continue to grow and serve the needs of the students of Saskatchewan. For the 2022-23 school year, historical high schools will receive $5.7 million, an increase of $227,000 for enrollment growth. There's also $20.1 million for associate schools in the 2022-23 school year. This is an increase of just over $170,000, or 1%. Through this budget, our government is continuing to provide safe and inclusive learning environments for students with an investment of $168.6 million in school infrastructure. This includes $95.2 million to support 20 ongoing capital projects to build 15 new schools and provide major renovations to 5 existing schools. Construction is currently underway on a new joint-use facility with 2 elementary schools to replace Argyle and Ecole St. Pius elementary schools here in Regina. These two new schools are expected to be ready to welcome students in the fall of 2023. Work is also well underway on a renovation and addition to Holy Rosary High School in Lloydminster. Later this spring, construction will begin on projects for a new kindergarten to grade 12 school in Blaine Lake and renovations to Yorkton Regional and Lloydminster Comprehensive High Schools. Planning is currently underway on renovations and an addition to John Paul II Collegiate in North Battleford, a new school, a K-12 school to replace and consolidate the elementary and high schools in Carrot River, a new K-12 school to replace and consolidate the elementary and high schools in Lanigan, a new elementary school to replace Descharmes Elementary School in Laloche, a new elementary school to replace St. Francis Cree Bilingual School in Saskatoon, a new elementary school to replace 3 elementary schools in Saskatoon's city centre, a new joint-use facility with 2 new elementary schools in Moose Jaw to consolidate 4 existing schools, a new Francophone elementary school in Regina, a new joint-use facility with 2 elementary schools to replace 4 elementary schools in North Regina, and a new joint-use facility with 2 elementary schools in Regina's Harbour Landing neighbourhood. These are significant investments that will serve students and families in these communities for years to come. In addition to these major capital investments, we've created a new minor capital renewal program this year. This program will allow school divisions to address structural repairs, renovations, and additions to prolong the life of schools around the province. In 22-23, we are providing $4.5 million for the minor capital renewal program to support renovations at Kyle Composite School and Ecole St. Margaret School. Both schools will undergo structural repairs and downsizing of school infrastructure to lower the operating costs for the school divisions and to prolong the life of the schools. I'm pleased to say that since 2008, the Government of Saskatchewan has committed approximately $2.3 billion towards school infrastructure projects. These projects include 57 new or replacement schools, as well as 30 renovation projects. Also included with the school capital investment is $55.9 million for preventative and emergency maintenance, $12 million to buy or move relocatable classrooms in the 2023-24 school year, and $1 million for school facility assessments. These programs allow school divisions to proactively maintain their current facilities and to address the growth needs in some of our fastest growing communities. This ultimately provides students with safe, quality learning environments where they can learn and grow. The Government of Saskatchewan is also committed to supporting families and young children through quality, affordable, and accessible early learning programs. The 2022-23 budget provides $309.6 million investment for early learning and childcare. This includes $284.6 million for regulated childcare, including an increase of $212.2 million provided through the two federal-provincial early years agreements. Through these agreements, the province is committed to creating 6,100 more childcare spaces around the province as part of an overall goal to create 28,000 new regulated spaces in the next 5 years. The province is also committed to further reducing parent fees in regulated childcare. Starting in February of 2022, parents with children under the age of 6 had their childcare fees reduced by an average of 50% in regulated care. Retroactive payments going back to July 1st, 2021 are currently being processed, and parents are now paying less. This year's funding will support further reducing these parent fees as early as September 2022 to ensure that families have access to affordable, quality care. This not only supports families, it supports a strong Saskatchewan economy by allowing parents to enter or return to the workforce or to further their own education. Saskatchewan is ahead of schedule on delivering an average of $10 a day regulated childcare for families in the province. We also believe that it's important that our childcare facilities be inclusive, which is why this year's budget provides $2.3 million for inclusion of children with disabilities in childcare facilities. It's also important that we continue to support our early childhood educators and childcare operators. With this in mind, this year's allocation provides $11.4 million for training initiatives and supports for early childhood educators, $9 million for preventative maintenance and repair for childcare facilities, $3.6 million for a one-time change management grant for childcare facilities to assist operators with increased administrative costs related to the facilities providing retroactive payments to parents and their staff, and $2 million to upgrade and replace the data system used for licensing childcare facilities. These supports will go a long way to support educators and facilities in serving our youngest learners. This government has allocated funding for 9,114 new center-based childcare spaces, a 98% increase in spaces since 2007. And we're also actively working to increase the number of available regulated home-based childcare spaces across the province. In addition to the supports for childcare provided through the two federal agreements, the province is investing in a number of early childhood development programs. There's $5.2 million in provincial funding for early childhood intervention programs, an increase of $744,000 over last year. This will allow the 14 ESIPs across the province to address increased demand and wait lists for children experiencing developmental delays and disabilities. On average, ESIPs support more than 1,200 families annually. The budget provides $16.6 million for funding for Kids First, an increase of $326,000 over last year. These additional resources will allow Kids First regional and targeted programs to better serve our most vulnerable families as they work to support their children's development. Annually, the province reaches over 30,000 children and families in over 340 communities with Kids First programming. This budget includes $3.2 million for family resource centers, an increase of $57,000. Early years family resource centers play an important role in supporting families to nurture positive child development so that more children enter school with the skills that they need to continue to learn. There are currently 12 family resource centers operating in Saskatchewan, with 3 recently announced in Lloydminster, Swift Current, and Weyburn under development. Over the past year, thousands of families have benefited from services offered by early years family resource centers. From April 2020 to March 2021, the centers distributed 13,000 learning activity kits and had nearly 900,000 social media and web page views. The operational centers were also able to welcome more than 15,000 children and adults in person. These family resource centers are providing important resources and support to families, and I'm proud to see that these centers expand around the province through the support of the federal provincial agreements. The 2022-23 budget is keeping Saskatchewan's public libraries on track with a continued investment of $11.3 million. This includes $6.1 million in resource sharing grants for the 7 regional library systems, nearly $1 million for the Northern Library System, and $1.4 million for the municipal libraries in Regina, Saskatoon, and Prince Albert. Additional supports for libraries include $2.4 million to support internet connectivity through CommunityNet and $114,000 to support the Saskatchewan Information and Library Services Initiative, which brings together the public library systems and the Provincial Library and Literacy Office to provide access to Saskatchewan residents, no matter where they live, to materials held at over 300 public libraries across the province. There's also $100,000 to support out-of-province interlibrary loans and $100,000 to support services for people with print disabilities. Our government is continuing to support literacy programs in this year's budget with $559,000 to support the network of 9 family literacy hubs. This is a $9,000 increase over last year. Family literacy hubs work with schools, libraries, and communities to provide family literacy program services and supports for families. And we're also continuing to provide $500,000 to support summer literacy programs provided by 8 school divisions. These programs offer important support for students to maintain and improve their reading during July and August. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks on the Ministry of Education budget. I'm excited about the investments that the government has made to support students, early learners, and families. It's vitally important to ensure that we have a prosperous future in our province, and we look forward to the discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Mr. Love, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, just want to say thank you to the Minister, to his deputy ministers, and all the officials who are here. And I mean this absolutely sincerely. I appreciate the work that you do. You know, I'm a big believer that we have in Saskatchewan and throughout Canada, you know, we have world-class education systems. I've been privileged to teach in one, to have children in one, and I'm honored to serve as critic for this area. So I say that sincerely. I appreciate the work that you do. My intention, I think all of our intention, is that we have the best province in Canada to raise a kid, to teach a kid, and to be a kid. And to the questions I'll bring forward to this committee and the discussions that will take place here will be in pursuit of that common goal. So I thank you for your work and for all of the time it takes into preparing a budget and to considering all of the needs that are out there in the world of education and childcare in Saskatchewan. I want to get into some questions off the top, just related to the Ministry of Education itself. And my first question is, if the minister could update the committee on the number of FTEs for salaried positions that work at the ministry, and if there's any change this year, as well as any capital projects or new expenditures taking place at the Ministry of Education.
Okay, thank you for the question, Mr. Levin. Appreciate your comments at the beginning of this as well, and look forward to the discussion with you. So we are forecasting 266 and a half FTEs. That's an increase of about 20 FTEs. Most of those are related to supporting the development and implementation of the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Agreement. And then there are, so that would be the bulk of the 20 FTEs. I believe it's 16 FTEs are based on that.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Looking again at the first sub-vote here and the estimates, I'm wondering if you can comment at all on other increases. So I see a small increase in salaries, but sizable increases for things like goods and services, accommodation services, central services. If you can just comment on what kind of increased costs is the ministry itself incurring, or do you project the ministry to incur in this budget year?
For the question, so the net increase is approximately $470,000. The bulk of that, nearly $400,000, is an increase in rent expense, and $73,000 is related to central IT, enterprise IT expenses increasing.
And does the ministry prepare or budget for any other increases in costs related to supplies, contracts, transportation? Does the ministry budget in particular, I see the increase in goods and services. Is there any consideration for increased costs due to inflation at the ministry?
No, we don't.
Okay, why not?
I get a drink of water.
Johnson, Deputy Minister. So with respect to your question, why do we not have any increases in the ministry budget? Generally, it would be because we, on a regular basis go through our operations, and we're looking for opportunities to do things more efficiently. When we compare this past year to the current year, as with many organizations, there would have been parts of our budget that we didn't spend. Like in the ministry, we have a small travel budget so that we can attend meetings and do that sort of thing. We're expecting to have sufficient funds to continue to do that in the new year when we do some more traveling than what we have done the last 2 years. And we found other efficiencies, and granted, some of them are relatively small in the grand scheme of things, particularly in this, in the scheme of our $2.8 billion budget. But things like managed print procurement, which to get away from the bureaucratic lingo, what that means is how many printers we have in the ministry. So we've reviewed all of where the printers are in the ministry. We're reducing the number of printers that we have. We don't even use them, honestly, that much anymore because we're going more and more paperless, despite what you might see with the binder in front of me. But we are doing more and more paperless work in the ministry. So some of those operating costs that we had previously have been reduced. And, as the minister mentioned with respect to the question around FTE utilization, we do have an increase on the early years front, and that is related to the delivery of the Canada-wide agreement. And so he mentioned the 16 FTEs. So there is an increase to the administrative budget, I guess, for the ministry in the early years world. And that increase also includes some costs associated with some contract work, which will be done to meet the terms of our agreement with the early years and with the federal government. And part of that does involve looking at a new reporting system, so an IT system of some sort.
Okay, so just ask a follow-up question for clarity on that. It seems as though there is, some acknowledgement that there will be increase in costs, as like every sector is experiencing that this year, but that your stance that at the ministry, you're not calculating the amount of increased costs, you're just solving that internally by finding efficiencies. Is there any kind of dollar or percentage amount that you're thinking, efficiencies that will need to be found to cover for other increases? I noticed that there's a 5.2% increase to goods and services here. So would that be the number that you need to find efficiencies internally, or what kind of internal calculations has the ministry made to account for the pressures that everyone is experiencing?
Well, and I think when you're looking at that 5% increase that you're calculating, I think you're looking at page 36 in the book, right? And again, that increase in goods and services is coming related to the space that we lease for our employees across the province, and we lease that space through SAS Builds and procurement. So. I think, part of those questions might need to be directed to SAS Builds and procurement, but I wouldn't take that 5% increase on leased space as the proxy for increases, generally speaking, in the ministry.
And is that increase in rent, is that due to the additional full-time equivalent salaried workers coming into work on the early learning childcare front, or is that an increase due to the, increase in rent for the same space? Was there an expansion of the space, in other words, I guess?
Yeah, sorry, no expansion of the space yet.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that. And I'll mention, there was one year when I went paperless in my classroom, and I loved it. I'd never go back. The amount of cleaning I did at the end of the day went down. I want to get in a few questions related to capital expenditures, and I'm wondering if we can get an update on the total value of deferred maintenance across all divisions. I have numbers. The last numbers I have would be from 2019. I'm wondering if you can update us with the most recent numbers on the total value of deferred maintenance.
Okay, thanks for your question, Mr. Levin, for your patience. There's lots of information with respect to capital. So it had been identified as a $1.3 billion deficit several years ago under an old methodology. And so we're now in year 3 of 5 of doing facility audits under a new methodology. We have 9 school divisions left over the next 2 years of this 5-year audit cycle that we have to work with. And then after that, we'll be on a continued 5-year cycle. I think it's important to note that despite the change in the methodology and the fact that we're in the midst of a 5-year facility audit, certainly work has not stopped on maintenance of our school facilities. In fact, this budget includes $54 million in preventative maintenance. That's up from $50 million last year, almost a 10% increase. As well, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, we've created a new minor capital program of $4.5 million in this budget. And all told, preventative maintenance and renewal funding since 2013-14 has nearly or has exceeded $386 million in that time. And so we're, as I said, we're working with a number of school divisions as a part of year 4 and 5 of the facility audit, and we'll be certainly continuing to fund the important work of capital across the school system.
Thanks, Minister. So in year 3 of 5, I understand the new system, and I may have future questions about how that is different from how numbers were calculated in the past. But it's possible I could have missed it there as I was writing some notes down. But do you have a number for the total deferred cost at this point, or are you saying that's hard to calculate because you haven't gotten through all divisions yet? And I guess if you don't have that number, what can we expect that after you've been through all divisions, or at the end of when would that number be able to be reported to the committee?
Thanks, Mr. Love, for the question. So $1.3 billion is the most complete picture that we have to date, but I would say that that's using an older methodology or an old methodology. So as a part of this 5-year facility audit cycle, we're working towards a new methodology, or working with a new methodology, and we are currently working with SAS Builds I guess in order to be able to get to the point where we're able to, I guess, show what the maintenance deficit would look like under the new methodology, knowing that it's an incomplete picture because we still have 2 years left to go and 9 school divisions to work with. So, but we are working with SAS Builds on what that would look like.
So can you tell me what would make the new methodology significantly different, that the ministry doesn't have a number that's more recent than 3 years old to report?
Lori Jensen, Assistant Deputy Minister. So the change in the methodology is these are really visual inspections, the facility audits, where someone will go in and review a facility, walk through a facility to see, identify possible maintenance that needs to be done. The real change in the methodology is the old methodology used point-in-time standards. So it would be you would have one picture at year one, and then 5 years later you would update that. The new methodology really takes into account the planned maintenance that's going to happen between those two audit periods to give us a more complete picture, because school divisions will make plans for their use of their maintenance dollars on a 3-year running average or running period. And the new methodology really will factor in that if a school division has plans to replace a roof section, that is included in their condition index prior to the next 5-year period. So it's really trying to give us an accurate picture of what that looks like on an ongoing basis.
So, final question here, when would the number be ready to be updated?
So as the minister stated, right now we're working with SAS Builds to get the partial picture of the condition in the audits that have been completed to date. So we can have at least a partial picture of what that condition, facility condition looks like, where at the end of the 5-year cycle, which would be 2025, we will have that complete picture of all school divisions using the new methodology.
So would it be possible to get an updated picture table to this committee the next time that we meet of the audits that have been submitted in the first 3 years of the program?
We will follow up with SAS Builds to identify if we can have that information available. That's the work that we have ongoing with them, is to just gather that information from them.
Okay, so just to be clear, like, and it's okay if you don't know, but will you table an update the next time the committee meets of the information that's already come in the first 3 years of the program?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Love. So we will, I can't commit that we'll have that information from SAS Builds, working with SAS Builds, in time for the next committee, but we will undertake what you've asked for and work with them to be able to present it to the committee.
Great, thank you. Continuing to think about facilities, can you tell me in this school year, 2021-22, how many schools are at or over capacity in the province? And if you need to take time to look into this, I'd be willing to just ask for an update to this number even by the end of our meeting time this afternoon. I'm interested in how many are at or over capacity, including how many are over 120% capacity and how many are over 140% capacity. And again, if this takes time, I can move on to other questions and get an answer when it's ready.
No, I think if you just give us a quick moment, I think we can provide that information. Okay, thanks for the question. So 53 out of 625 schools would be over 100% utilization. Of those 19 are at over 110% utilization. And so I would say that there's a lot of fluctuation that can take place in a given school year in that 100 to 110. So we really focus on over the 110 kind of as the metric of where we would look to work with school divisions to provide some relief on those. So it's 19 are currently over 110% utilization.
And you don't track any number higher, you don't track 130 or 140?
No, we don't.
Okay, thanks very much, Minister. I want to turn right now just a few questions on operating funding. First of all, I just want to clarify, Minister Duncan, in your opening remarks, I was writing as fast as I could, but I'm not all that fast. So the number for increase in operating funding is 29.4%, an increase of 1.5%. And in your opening remarks, you said that that will provide funding for a listed number of professional designations, including speech language pathologists, psychologists, I may have heard occupational therapists, as well as the teacher contract. Now, I can check the Hansard record for those comments, but I'm wondering if you can just help me understand here, looking at the $29.4 million increase, how much of that was designated as, how much have you costed the 2% increase to the teacher contract?
$23.4 million has been allocated towards the increase in the teacher's contract.
And of the remaining amounts, so going back to your opening comments, and feel free to, quote yourself here, I guess, how much of the remaining, roughly $6 million would you say will be available for school divisions to add to their complement of the professional designations that you mentioned, with psychologists, therapists, speech language pathologists? I know that you don't typically prescribe to school divisions, but just looking at your comments, like what do you think of that $6 million might we see as increases in all those important folks who support our students?
So the $6 million will be earmarked towards the Supports for Learning portion of the operating grant. So that brings that up to nearly $300 million, $299.9 million.
Okay. Were there any other costs calculated in preparing for this year's budget? Any other costs that will be hitting school divisions that the ministry has considered in that $6 million increase?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Love. So there's a number of factors that go into building the budget, and so speaking specifically to the supports for learning, we look at a number of factors as a ministry, working with school divisions, working with other ministries, so looking at enrollment levels, vulnerability in immigration data. The vulnerability data can include things like low income, transiency, children in foster care, for example. And so the supports for learning is, so it's a $6 million increase for the learning supports, and so school divisions will decide where they will use those funds in terms of the professionals and paraprofessionals that they choose to hire based on what they're seeing in terms of the needs of the students. And then as a part of the increase for the teachers' collective bargaining agreement, 1.8 million includes salary increases for those learning professionals that are a part of the supports for learning, but that also hold a teacher's certificate, so they are part of the CBA negotiations.
Okay. So the $6 million supports for learning, as you mentioned, I know there's lots of things that we consider, and I want to get into, not right now, but maybe shortly today if we have time, around intensive supports, students who require intensive support. So I do want to ask about that. But just related to the $6 million, so again, you said in your opening comments that it will provide for hiring of more SLPs, psychologists, and so on. But that's really up to school divisions if there's any money left as they face increased costs in other areas. Other areas like transportation increases, cost of fuel, cost of busing, increased contracts for non-teaching staff, as well as inflationary costs. Does the ministry calculate any of those numbers when landing on a number for learning supports? Because really, any of the learning supports that you suggested will come after all those other costs are met. You know, they've got to pay the bills before they hire new. So has the ministry done any calculations on what those costs will be to the divisions?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Love. So there's, I think I'll maybe start by saying that we certainly are aware and recognize that there may be some inflationary pressures that school divisions will be facing this year as they formulate their own budgets and present those to the ministry later this summer. But we recognize that two of the largest cost drivers for school divisions and their budgets are teacher salaries and enrollment. And so in terms of trying to find, when we submit our budget for the provincial education budget and try to factor in those major cost drivers, but also the balance between the fact that, for the most part, operating budgets provided by the province to school divisions are unconditional. So there's always that kind of balance that we have in terms of trying to identify where we know school divisions will be pressured, but not being overly prescriptive in saying that, you know, this is your fuel budget, so this is the amount that you're going to get an increase. This is your budget for this area. You're going to get an increase. We work with Treasury Board and during the finalization process to see some increases in some areas that we know will be a pressure. Obviously, the negotiated contract, we want to fund that, as well as supports for learning. We hear that from school divisions. But it's not necessarily a process of deconstructing every single school division budget and then applying inflation or applying other cost drivers to every single line item in a budget. Trying to keep that balance between what we're going to ask Treasury Board for the upcoming year for school operating budgets, and acknowledging that, for the most part, we are not prescriptive, and that school divisions have these funds and they are unconditional. And so, you know, I'd be happy to get into more of a discussion and get the DM and the ADM involved to kind of dive deeper into kind of what that process looks like. But that's at a pretty high level, I would say, that we understand that there will be some inflationary pressures, but trying to keep that in context in terms of how we build our provincial budget and then what that looks like for the school divisions when they receive their allocation.
I guess, Minister, one of the challenges that I have here is to look at this and say that the fully funding a teacher contract was hopefully not something that you hope to do, but something that you have agreed to do. That the teacher contract is agreed to at the bargaining table in good faith and doesn't represent an increased investment in classroom learning. What it represents is fulfilling a contract that you promised you would fulfill years ago. And that the inflationary costs are, you know, and that's out of the control of the 27 school divisions. The inflationary costs are much harder to predict in terms of what divisions are facing now. And I guess my question is to come back to the discussion off the top. Is the approach the same, is the expectation the same for our 27 school divisions as the approach at the ministry, which is that they'll find efficiencies internally to deal with the increased cost of inflation?
All right, so to your question, we don't establish any expectations of school divisions finding particular efficiencies in terms of an efficiency target, if you will. We do know that they do find efficiencies on a regular basis, like every other organization, whether it's in the school sector or in any other sector. We all look at how we conduct our business, and we look for and find efficiencies on an ongoing basis. So when we're developing the budget, we do understand the cost drivers. We take that information into our process, and we come out the other end with a budget increase. And the school divisions then will take their total budget allocation, and they'll determine how best to make use of those dollars, knowing that they can do things the same as they did last year, or they can do things differently. And doing things differently can be sometimes demonstrating certain efficiencies that they've learned of over the last year or two.
Okay, so Mr. Duncan, you talked about the two big things driving increasing costs being negotiated contracts and student enrollment. I'm wondering if you can update the committee on projected enrollment numbers. How many of the 27 divisions are projecting increases in enrollment for next school year?
Thanks for the question. In terms of projected enrollment, so we have 13 school divisions that are projecting a decrease in enrollment, 14 that are projecting an increase in enrollment. So that's, in total, it's about a 1,300 FTE increase over the entire 27 school divisions. But I think an important note is that we have been funding since 2019-2020 177,350 FTEs. And so even with the increase of 1,300 FTEs in this upcoming school year, we'll be still funding at a level that is 1,500 greater than the actual students that are enrolled. So we saw enrollment decrease over the last 2 years, and we chose not to take that out of the base budgets of the school divisions, obviously for obvious reasons over the last 2 years and the pandemic. And so school divisions are still operating at a funded level for FTEs that we haven't even hit that enrollment number yet. So that's one of the areas that when we talk about pressures, and enrollment is typically a pressure for school divisions, but enrollment hasn't recovered from the effects of the pandemic, and yet those dollars that were there for those students in 2019-2020 were not taken out of the base of the school divisions in the last 3 years now.
Yeah, and I think that was the right thing to do, not to claw back that funding when enrollment went down from divisions to base their budget, base their budgets earlier. But just to be clear, are you committing, Minister, that will continue, that until we surpass that previous benchmark, the high mark for number of students, that funding will continue at that level, even if the actual student numbers, even with the 1,300 student increase, it won't hit that number? You won't be, there won't be any proposal to bring those funds back from divisions.
Yeah, certainly it's part of this budget, and we would have to look to see what next year's enrollment numbers look like as we build out next year's budget. So I can't commit more than a year at a time, but certainly this budget does, the operating grant for this budget does reflect that we have not pulled those dollars out of school divisions.
So as you look back, I know this is maybe going back a couple of years, I think we all kind of experienced that pandemic time warp where we sometimes forget what year it is, but where did those students go? And why have they been slow to come back? Has the ministry investigated this? I mean, I can make my own predictions, but probably not as qualified as yours. So where did those students go, and why have they been slow to come back? Even as we're seeing, I think last year was 1,612 more students. Projecting next year, roughly 1,300. Where are the ones that aren't accounted for?
Thanks for the question. Two points I'll touch on in terms of what we believe affected enrollment over the last number of years. I think earlier in the pandemic, obviously grade 12 students were leaving school, and we didn't see the same number as expected students that were entering the school system in pre-K and kindergarten. Some families just chose not to enroll their kids in kindergarten. And then the other reason would be, which affects, so that really affects kind of at the upper end and the lower end, and the area that really affects all grade levels is just reduced immigration over the course of the pandemic.
Okay. Has the ministry decided or released operating funding allocations for next school year, 22-23, to divisions? And if so, can you table that as opposed to reading all 27? Has that been released to divisions, and can you table that answer for the committee?
Yeah, we can table it for the committee. We can provide that. We have public released that information and released it to school divisions as well.
Okay. Maybe just coming back to the question of enrollment, and in particular, talked about decrease in immigration. The last numbers that I have are from the 2019-2020 school year, that there were 17,898 EAL students province-wide. Can you tell the committee how many there are in this school year? in 21-22, and if there's any projections for next year. I'm getting to my next question here too, but if there's any projections for next year, particularly as our province has indicated that our doors will be wide open to Ukrainian refugees arriving in Saskatchewan.
Thanks for the question. So in 2021, which would be the most recent snapshot that we would have in terms of EAL learners, the number would be 15,854. And I think you referenced 2019 would be the last year that you had numbers for, so it would have been, so it was, I'll just give you these numbers. 2019, it was 17,421. 2020, it was 17,627. And then in 2021, reduced down to 15,854. We don't, I can't provide at this point in terms of what school divisions are projecting for 2022-23, and certainly I think it's too early to say what, particularly on your question on our opening our doors to people fleeing Ukraine, what that might mean for the school system. I think it's too early for us to really be able to advise on that.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Minister. I'm just out of curiosity, I guess, outside of any numbers of how many students we might be welcoming from Ukraine, are there any preparations of the ministry as far as, preparing for that? And even though we don't know what it is, are there any kind of discussions or preparations going on you could enlighten us to?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Love. So the Ministry of Education is a part of an interministry working group that's being led by ICT. So we are in the process of a number of things that I can mention here this afternoon. One is looking at any regulatory changes that we would have to make under the Education Act that would allow for education to be provided to students from Ukraine free of charge. So waiving or canceling any tuition fees that otherwise would be required for an international student. So that's one of the things that we are working on. We're also working with sector partners on in the event that any of the adults that are fleeing Ukraine and landing in Saskatchewan are teachers. We're working with sector partners to assess their certification and with the possibility of employing them within the school system in Saskatchewan. And as well, because of what the federal government has indicated, that work permits would be issued to people that are landing in Canada from Ukraine. Certainly, it's my understanding that work permits would be issued quite soon after they arrive. And so we're looking at opportunities, particularly teachers, as we're working through that certification process and that work with different sector partners. If there's maybe an ability to for them to utilize those work permits and find employment as EAs or perhaps ECEs in our early learning child care centers. So those are the most immediate priorities that we're working on this file.
Great, thanks for that, Minister. Just to come back to a couple of questions on operating, I'm wondering if you can also table an answer to the 13 divisions with projecting a decrease and the 14 projecting an increase. If you could just divide into those two groups, that would be really helpful.
Yep, we will provide that.
Thank you. And maybe the last question for now on the operating funding. I'm wondering, is the ministry aware of any increases to contracts for non-teaching staff? So you indicated that the 20, I think it's 23.4, yeah, $23.4 million for teaching, 2% teacher contract includes other designations of, for example, ed psychologists who have a teaching degree. But I'm specifically wondering if the ministry is aware of any non-teaching staff, folks who work in schools without an education degree, who will have contractual increases in the next school year that school divisions will have to account for. Is the ministry aware of any contractual increases that school divisions will need to pay for?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Love. So I would just say that school divisions don't they don't require our approval as they negotiate or enter into negotiate with their non-teacher CBA hired staff in terms of negotiations. And so we typically just find out after, I guess, after the fact in terms of what they negotiate. We do anticipate that there will be obviously either contracts that have been settled that have wage or benefit increase or wage increases, benefit increases, wage and benefit, yeah, wage and benefit increases, and there would be, likely tables, I don't have that information in front of me, likely tables that would still be open that haven't completed negotiations. So there likely will, as a part of school division's budget in this year, be costs related to other contracts outside of the CBA.
Yeah, and my question is, which ones are you currently aware of?
So we don't have a list of all the ongoing negotiations with various unions. We are aware that certain school divisions will be negotiating right now with unions such as QP. We are aware that there is an agreement with health sciences that could be used as a benchmark. That agreement goes till 2024, I believe. So as school divisions go about these negotiations with their various unions for caretakers or IT professionals, they use, as the minister stated, the benchmarks that are created throughout the province, as well as understanding of what their current budget is and how their allocation can accommodate and make the best decisions possible for their school division and their budget.
So I guess that my question is really about that additional $6 million and how much of that would already be negotiated, even at the school board level, to other non-teaching staff, IT professionals, cleaning staff, caretakers, office staff. I mean, anyone who's worked in a school knows if you need anything, if you want to see how the school is run, you got to go to the head secretary and treat that person well. And I guess that I'm wondering if there's any knowledge at the ministry level how those additional costs will, what kind of chunk that will take out of the $6 million for learning supports. And I understand that you're not making those decisions, but just, I guess the question is about an awareness of how those other contracted increases would bite into that money for learning supports.
Okay, thanks for the question. So we're estimating, and again, using the health sciences agreement as kind of a proxy, because certainly there would be contracts that haven't been concluded. But using that number, we're estimating that school divisions across the province will face, for their non-teaching staff, 1.8% or $4.9 million in anticipated salary increases.
Okay. Thanks, Minister. I want to ask a couple questions about the increased funding for the new designation of qualified independent schools, which I understand from your opening comments, Minister, you talked about the new category will be called certified independent schools as an intermediate step between the several associate schools that we have in this province and fully independent schools. Can you just let me know, and this is probably a number I can find, how many schools do you anticipate fitting into this new category, the new category of certified independent schools? I'm guessing this is kind of for next school year, the 22-23 school year. How many do you think would qualify to be in that category?
So with respect to the new certified independent school category, there would be 2 schools that would currently meet all the eligibility requirements.
So with the increase of $2.3 million for qualified independent schools up to a total of $17.5 million, is it fair to say that will be, how will that be dispersed between the 2 schools in the new category?
Okay, thank you for the question. So the 17 million, that's the funding for both the qualified independent school as well as the historical high schools. Those are largely driven by, so historical high schools is a $227,000 increase. That's enrollment related. The qualified independent schools, that's an increase of 2.335 million. And that is, so there are 2 new schools that now qualify for the funding that follows the qualified independent schools. And there are 2 schools, so that's 2 new qualified independent schools, and there are 2 schools that would meet the eligibility requirements for the new new certified independent school, and one of those, or I guess one of those would be, they both would have been funded in the past either as a qualified independent or grandfathered funding from former associate status.
Can you tell me what those, I think it's 4 schools. Can you tell me what those 4 schools are?
I don't know.
I would also be open to just tabling the answer. The 4 names of the schools. Or just, I would also be open to tabling the answer to the 4 names if you don't have the 4 names right away.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mr. Love. So I would say at this point, the 4 schools that would be eligible for each category have not applied to fall under those new categories. So we build it into our budget in the event that they do apply, but at this point they haven't applied. So I think it's probably In the event that they do apply, I would be happy to table that with the committee, but at this point, nobody has applied, so it's kind of a moot point.
Okay, so getting close to the end of our time, this might be my last question. Again, just looking at, so the operating increase for 625 public schools was $6 million, of which the ministry calculates that 4.9 million will go to increase contract costs for non-teaching staff. So that leaves 1.1 million for 625 schools. But for 2 certified independent schools, there's an increase of 2.5 million. Could the minister just comment on the discrepancy between those numbers?
And thank you for the question, Mr. Love. So just to be clear, the $2.5 million increase, both for qualified independent schools and historical high schools, that's not just related to two schools. Qualified independent schools are 22 in the province. Historical high schools, I believe there are 4 in the province. And those were largely driven by enrollment growth. In terms of the increase for operating for school divisions across the province, not to belabor the point, but certainly when I request when we go to the Treasury Board for a submission, we do factor in the teacher's contract, because that, for most school divisions, makes up 50% of the operating costs. So we can't ignore that. That is a large part of school operating. So I include that in the number in terms of the increase that went to school divisions this year. And I would just note that the qualified independent enrollment, I think, is up 15%. And enrollment is up within our school divisions, but I think it's up less than 1%. I think it's 0.7%. And again, we haven't even caught up to the 2019-2020 enrollment that we're currently funding in school divisions.
That should be the 2021.
Sorry, if I could just clarify, sorry, I keep saying 1920. It was the 2021 projected enrollment.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. So, just so my understanding is clear, your position is that the increase, the additional 2.5 million for the whole category, including the 4 historical high schools, 22 qualified independent schools, of which 2 of those will move into the new category, or are those 2 not already on the list of the 22? Like, does that make sense? Okay. So your position is that the increase, the additional 2.5 million, is driven by an increase in enrollment?
Yeah, thank you. So the increase is primarily driven by enrollment.
So could you let me know how many actual students that 15% represents? What's the number of actual full-time equivalent students that will be sharing that $2.5 million increase? And I know that we don't fund per student, but as a ballpark figure, how many students does that 15% represent? We'll be back. This isn't the end.
Sorry, we're trying to track down the numbers. The estimated enrollment increase for the qualified independent school is 290, and I'll try to get the historical high schools as well. I only have the one.
Sorry, Minister, you say you're working at the historical high school still right now? Okay.
Yeah, we'll endeavor to bring those back. I know the numbers we have here look to be 21, 22, and not the projections for the upcoming year. So we'll endeavor to bring those back to the committee.
Yeah, great. I appreciate that. Again, just for my own understanding, I don't want to make sure I'm clear. When we're talking historical high schools, we're talking Athol Murray, Rosthern Junior College, Luther, LCBI.
Yeah, that's right. So Athol Murray College, Notre Dame, Luther College, LCBI, and Rosthern Junior College. Yeah.
And we're talking qualified independent schools, the 22, that include Saskatoon Christian School. So let me put this, these would not include any schools in an associate agreement?
That's correct.
And of the 22 schools, is it safe to assume that all of them charge some type of tuition?
The ability to, but not all do.
When you say they have the ability to, what kind of parameters does the ministry set on the amount of tuition, or how involved is the ministry in terms of working with these schools to allow them to remain financially viable?
They have the independence through legislation to set their tuition.
Okay. And I also noticed in the capital spending some investment at Athol Murray College at Notre Dame. Are all of these schools eligible to submit proposals? Would they be included in the deferred maintenance costs and assessments? Are they? How does the province treat these schools when it comes to capital investment compared to, a public school in any city or town?
Thank you for the question. So we provide no capital dollars to qualified independent schools. We have the ability on approved projects to fund up to 20% of a major capital project at a historical high school, and we provide no maintenance or preventative maintenance for either one.
Thanks for clarifying that. Maybe just I probably have time for one more question. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Again, just looking at the projected numbers, so I know you'll give me the historical numbers, but with an increase in 290 in the qualified independent schools, and at only 4 historical high schools, I think we could say that the increase in enrollment won't be that much. A lot of them are struggling, I know, to maintain enrollment levels that keep them viable, and so probably wouldn't be a lot. Again, we're looking at, maybe ballpark figure 300 and some students. And yeah, that's an increase of 2.5 million and a projected increase of 1,300 students in the 625 public schools, public and Catholic schools in the province, looking at an increase that will amount to 1.1 million. Again, I'm just wondering if you can shed any light on the discrepancy between those numbers in terms of how enrollment impacts the increases.
We're past 5:15. I just talked to the critic, and he's happy to get that answer from you at the beginning of our next session, if that works for you.
Yep.
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much. Having reached or agreed upon time for consideration of these estimates, we will adjourn, and the committee will now be in recess till 6 p.m.